Έλα ρε μαλάκες, τι γίνεται? Εγώ είμαι ο Αριστόξενος, μουσικάς από την αρχαία Ελλάδα. Δεν γούσταρα να το τραβήξω καν αυτό το βίντεο, αλλά μπλέχτηκα με τον νόμο. Έπαιξα μπουνιές με ένα τύπο στο Πειραιά, του σπάσα τη μούρη. Και έσκασε ο δικαστής και μου λέει: η μπουζού, η κοινοφελής. Να μας ρε. So today we're going to be talking about what we know of the music of the Eastern Roman medieval empire, historiographically known as the Byzantine Empire. Now some disclaimers are going to be needed. So disclaimer number one, what do we mean by the Eastern Roman Empire in this case? Because we're talking about 1,000 years of history and variable, changing frontiers and limits. At a certain point in time, the Eastern Roman Empire had reconquered most of the Mediterranean. So of course we're not going to be talking about every single possible musical tradition that existed at any point in time under the jurisdiction of the Eastern Roman Empire. This would just be impossible. We don't have enough information to cover all those bases. No, instead the scope of this video will be limited to the cultural core of the Eastern Roman Empire, which is its Hellenic Greek-speaking portions in Anatolia and in Greece. Now, doubtless, the Eastern Roman Empire was absolutely a highly multicultural, highly multi-ethnic society on many levels. This cannot be debated. Basil II, for example. Many of you know about Basil II, who was one of the Eastern Roman emperors. He's an important Greek historical figure. However, I did not know this until I had a drink with him the other night in Piraeus. He told me his origins were Armenian.
At least according to Eastern Roman sources, but it's debated by historians.
His grandmother was an important Armenian historical figure called Kim Kardashian. By the way, Basil II, really chill guy, really cool dude to hang out with, have a mythos beer with, but a little bit sick in the head when it comes to Bulgarians. I made the mistake of inviting a Bulgarian to hang out with us, and let's just say the Bulgarians' eyesight did not improve. So just to clarify, the scope of this video will be limited to Anatolia and the Greek mainland, which were the Hellenic, Greek-speaking cultural core of the Eastern Roman Empire. We will not be dealing in this video with the other parts of the empire.
Disclaimer 1.
Whenever such videos are made, there's always a small minority of people. If you have, for example, 10,000 commenters on a video, you're always going to have 10 or 15 commenters going, where's the music, where's the music, why the talking, less talking, more music, less talking, more music. Such people demonstrate implicitly a very high degree of unfamiliarity with the field of history because they are clicking on a video about a historical form of music, and implicitly they're showing a confidence, a certainty that we have so much data, so much information about said historical form of music that they expect there to just be audio performances, just get to the audio performances, just play the music and stop wasting our time. Anybody who is familiar with the field of history will know that the field of history is the field of uncertainty, of incomplete data, of gaps in knowledge. Let's say that I just did that. How do you know which parts are speculative, which parts are not speculative, which parts are certain and which parts are not certain? How do you know that this instrument was chosen because we know that it existed back then or because it's probable that it existed back then? This is the problem with this mentality of just get to the point, just play the audio performances and stop wasting our time. So the approach is actually going to be us developing the knowledge and the intellectual framework through which we will be able to compartmentalize the audio reconstructions and identify which parts are speculative, which parts are not speculative, etc., etc. We will develop the tools through which we will understand what we are listening to.
Disclaimer 2.
Λοιπόν, if this is your first time being on this channel and you have never seen the other video essays on this channel, it would be a good idea to watch this chapter. For all of those who have seen other videos, you can skip. But for those of you who are new to this channel, there's a high degree of likelihood that you believe in an oft-repeated and seldom-corrected myth, which is that Greek music was Turkified or Orientalized. Basically, anybody who listens to Greek traditional music, most of the forms of Greek traditional music at least, will notice that there is a character in it, a morphological set of features that make it very similar to Middle Eastern music. this is very true, the morphological features of Greek music are fundamentally the same as that of Middle Eastern or Anatolian or North African music. But where people go wrong is that they always assume that this is because of the 400 years of Turkish rule over these lands, and so therefore this is why Greeks have music that sounds like the Middle East. This is the equivalent of looking at the Hagia Sophia, seeing that it's very similar to the mosques of Istanbul, and then saying, oh, therefore the Hagia Sophia was modeled on the mosques of Istanbul. What we know today as Middle Eastern music is highly dependent to a fundamental degree upon ancient Greek music theory. This is from The Rise of Music in the Ancient World, East and West by Kurt Sachs. For Greek melodies were indeed Oriental, and their next of kin have lived in the Middle East to this day, not in the West.
These musical structures were also active before the Ottoman period too in Anatolia. Because in ancient Greece theory, we can very detailedly identify the intervals or the sounds that are still being used in Turkish music performance. All the instruments, tuning systems, and the sound material gives us a resemblance about the ancient Greece theory and practice, musical practice of course, with the future. When the Turks and the Islamic thought had arrived in Anatolia, there were this music being performed in Anatolia, makam-based music.
What happened was with Alexander's conquest. I mean, Alexander conquered the whole of Asia Minor. He moved out into the Iranian plateau. Yeah. There were Alexandrias that were all over the world. Egypt was just one of them. Greeks took their traditions, their Greek traditions, their Greek music, their language, and it became part of local tradition. Right. And it was from those traditions that Arabic music developed its maqam. This sort of Greek theory was very much central to the way they thought of their music. Now, what would have happened was some infiltration of Greek traditions with local musical traditions.
Early Muslims and Arab writers always consistently point to ancient Greek music to ancient Greek music theory as the basis for much of their music theory. Many of the modes, many of the sounds, many of the things that make Middle Eastern music recognizably Middle Eastern are in fact of ancient Greek origin. But basically the point is, if you clicked on this video expecting to know what was the sound of the pre-Turkification Greek music, what was the sound of Greek music when it still sounded Western European, when it was not Orientalized yet, well, I'm afraid to say you're looking for something like Atlantis or the Tooth Fairy, fairy tales. There is no such thing as a lost, ancient, native, Western-sounding Greek tradition that was Orientalized by the Ottomans. What you see, in fact, is that Greek music as it is today is a direct continuation of the musical practices that go all the way back to ancient Greek music. And so to put it in a very oversimplified term, Greek music always sounded Oriental. End of the disclaimer. Okay, now last disclaimer, and I'm going to drop character here and just speak as Faria Faragi for a second, because I know everybody in the comments is going to be like, oh my god, stop smoking, Faria, don't smoke, smoking is bad for you. I do not smoke. I hate smoking. The only reason you can see me smoking in this video is because I am playing the Greek person. And if you know anything about my channel, it's that I take cultural representation very seriously, because people are out there thinking that Zorba and democracy are the most Greek things ever. Nah. It's smoking and frappe. Frappe and smoking are the two pillars of Hellenic civilization. Λοιπόν, so one can ask, what are the origins of the music of the Eastern Roman Empire? And the answer is, rather obviously, in the music of the preceding civilization to it, which is ancient Greek civilization, ancient Greek music. A lot of people, when you talk to them, they have this image in their minds. They imagine that when Christianity came, suddenly new forms of music came with it completely. But this is not the case. Christianity and Islam, those Abrahamic religions, they were very successful at conversion because for the most part they were syncretic in nature. What they did very well was that they would adopt the aesthetic features of the pre-existing local customs and religions in order to make the conversion easier for the locals, and this is exactly what we see and witness with Christianity. So architecture, for example, if you look at the Vatican, well, guess what? The Vatican is to a fundamental degree, it's a pagan architecture in the sense that the columns and everything and much of the architecture is rooted in ancient Greek and ancient Roman principles. So the same thing applies to the music. You must not imagine that the sound of Orthodox chants, for example, is something that came out of the void with Christianity and was applied to ancient Greece. No, Orthodox chants have their roots in the musical systems of ancient Greece.
There indeed is a stream of tradition which leads to Middle Eastern music, that leads to Byzantine chant, that perhaps leads to Gregorian chant. I think there are many different streams into which the ancient Greek musical tradition diverged. The Romans had inherited all this Greek music and rhythm and so on. It had spread into the different areas of the Roman imperial world.
The roots of Byzantine music comes also from the Greek.
And the ancient Greek music has historically formed the basis of Byzantine music.
But what were those musical systems like?
Now there are two fundamental elements that become the foundational ingredients that become relevant to the development of music going into medieval Byzantium. The horizontality of ancient Greek music and the modality of it. Okay, what do we mean by horizontality? So, broadly speaking in ethnomusicology, we can categorize musical traditions as either fundamentally horizontal in their psychological framework or fundamentally vertical in their psychological framework. Vertical means that the practitioners of the music think primarily in terms of note combinations, simultaneous combination of different notes at the same time that procure a certain effect. So this combination of notes versus this combination of notes, kind of like a cocktail, you know, the kind of thing that tourists, when they come to Mykonos, there are musical traditions that are fundamentally driven, governed by the psychological interest in the combination, simultaneous combination of different notes at the same time. On the other hand, you have what constitutes the vast majority of musical traditions around the world, which are the horizontal traditions. Now, horizontal traditions are traditions that are centered around the development of a singular melodic line, and everybody follows this singular melodic line. Most European music, for most of its history before the development of the vertical systems of Western tonality, were horizontal in nature. Let me give you a practical example of what we mean by horizontal framework. So Irish music is one of the more conservative forms of European traditional music. You will have one of their songs. For example, these barbarians have a barbarian song that goes like this. Near Bambridge town in the county down one evening last July. Now, if you were to give this song to the Georgian barbarians, they would take the near Bambridge and they would near Bam. They would take, okay, this note, Bam. How about I harmonize it with another note? Bam, 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 bam. And they would choose a specific note to simultaneously sing at the same time as that main note in the same song. That is what drives their obsession. The Irish, because they have adopted a tradition that is primarily horizontal in nature, they don't think in those terms. Instead, they think in terms of the horizontal development. So they think more in terms of, okay, you have the main vocalist going near Bambridge town and the county down, and then the violinist is going to go. So they are thinking of, okay, can I add extra notes to ornament the main melody, following the main melody, but adding extra notes around the core melodies of the melodic skeleton, and how many ornaments can I put in there? Perhaps I will put a trill in my voice. If you listen to sounds singing, which is a traditional conservative form of singing in Irish traditional music, they do a lot of ornaments with their voice. Because again, horizontally driven modal musicians think in those terms, in terms of how to bring the melody to life through a series of musical expressive gestures like ornaments extra notes. Ancient Greek music is understood universally in musicology as having been primarily a horizontal musical tradition that was about the development of a singular melodic line. This is what becomes relevant to the later developments in the Middle Ages. What the Greeks of the Middle Ages inherit from us, the ancient Greeks, is a fundamentally horizontal musical paradigm. Now we have to be very careful to add some nuance here, because more recent researches in the field of ancient Greek music have revealed that ancient Greek music had more verticality than previously thought. So if you were to go back 200 years ago, musicologists would have told you with a very resounding firmness that no, ancient Greek music was 100% horizontal without any understanding of verticality. Well, this is not true, because myself, Aristoxenus, in my writings on ancient Greek music, I mention the fact that we had some understanding of simultaneous note combinations.
And Aristoxenus goes to argue that the earlier composers, they were not just ignorant of all the pitches there were, but they used the pitches, but they didn't use them for the melody, they used them only in the accompaniment. And he gives several pairs of notes where he says, this note is not in the melody, but it's used in the accompaniment in consonance with that melodic note, in dissonance with that melodic note.
You have a few scattered mentions of simultaneous note combinations in ancient Greek literature in the primary sources. However, we must be careful here. 99.99% of all of the writings that we ancient Greeks left to posterity was descriptions of horizontal musical systems. With the onset of the early Middle Ages, we see the emergence of different streams of musical traditions that come out of the Greco-Roman tradition. We have the Middle Eastern musical traditions of the Maccamic traditions, which are arguably the direct continuation of ancient Greek music. We have, of course, the music that continues in the Eastern Roman Empire, which we shall analyze further in the rest of this video. We also have the music that goes into Western Europe, especially the liturgical chanting traditions that are the predecessors of Gregorian chant and everything. And all of them, at the onset of the Middle Ages and late antiquity, are entirely horizontal in nature and do not deal with vertical note combinations as far as our understanding goes. This, coupled with the scarcity of mentions of vertical note combinations in ancient Greek musical literature, clearly shows to us that however much there have been vertical note combinations in ancient Greek music, it was not relevant enough to survive and become the foundations of the later successors of ancient Greek music, fundamentally rooted in the importance of their horizontal developments. But what are those horizontal developments? Well, primarily they are rooted in the modal framework of ancient Greek music. Ancient Greek music was fundamentally a modal tradition. What does modal mean? Mode means a specific combination of notes. We have many notes that we can play. You look at the piano, for example, you can play all of the notes, but if you start playing all of them without a certain cohesion to them, if you just start tapping, smashing all of the keys randomly, it doesn't give a sound that most cultures would say is very nice sounding. So all cultures throughout history have come to the conclusion of cherry-picking which notes they want to use in order to create a more harmonious feeling. And this is basically the concept of the mode, a specific configuration of notes. And this was the foundational basis of ancient Greek music, the usage of its many modes. You can watch this video that I filmed 2 years ago, where I explain some of the modes of ancient Greek music and what they sounded like. But basically, ancient Greek music had 3 categories of modes: the diatonic, the chromatic, and the enharmonic. Disclaimer here from Faria Fergie. If you're watching this video and you're somebody who studies the Byzantine chant tradition and you're a Byzantine chanter, you may be confused right now because the terms diatonic, chromatic, and enharmonic are used in modern Byzantine chant, but they are not used in the same way as Aristoxenus is using them in the video right now. Aristoxenus throughout this video will use the terms chromatic, enharmonic, and diatonic according to the ancient Greek definition. The modern Byzantine definition has taken the same words, but they mean completely different things. For example, enharmonic
in the ancient Greek definition, is the most weird and exotic kind of sound from a Western perspective. It's the microtonal kind of sounds that are very different. Whereas in the modern Byzantine chant tradition, enharmonic literally means the scales that are exactly identical to those found in Western music. So just in case you're somebody who studies Byzantine chant, you're going to have to rethink when I use the terms diatonic and harmonic and chromatic, I do not mean them in the definition of modern Byzantine chant.
So yeah, ancient Greek music was defined by a great variety of different modes. That's where the whole foundation of the music and its creative aspect, its music theory aspect lied. Lay, I don't know how to conjugate, I hate your English language. Barbaric language of barbaric, smelly Anglo-Saxons, disgusting. Λοιπόν, to summarize this chapter basically, you have ancient Greek... Malaka. To summarize this chapter basically, ancient Greek music leaves to posterity two fundamental musical ingredients that will become the foundational pillars of later medieval Greek Eastern Roman music. A fundamentally horizontal framework that is rooted in the development of horizontal musical expression, not rooted in vertical simultaneous note combination, and a modal framework that is characterized by the usage of a variety of specific modes. Now, let us analyze further how the modal framework of ancient Greek music continues into the Middle Ages.
Λοιπόν, so we were talking about how the modes of ancient Greek music continued into the Middle Ages, but it did not remain completely unchanged. What must be understood is that whilst the medieval Greek tradition was the unbroken continuation from the ancient Greek tradition, of course, things evolve and change through time.
Αριστόξενε ρε μαλάκα, ακόμα μου χρωστάς τα 10 ευρώ που σκάγεσαι κέιτα. Την περασμένη Πέμπτη, σου ορκίζομαι, αν δεν μου τα δώσεις πίσω ρε φίλε, θα μπουκάρω στο σπίτι σου και θα σου σπάσω τα. Γόνατα με σφυρί, κλεφτοψυχάρα. Νομίζεις ότι είσαι ασφαλής ρε, έχω φίλους απ' τη Μάνη ρε, νομίζεις οι κριτικοί φίλοι που κάνεις χόρτο μαζί, τους είναι επικίνδυνοι. Σκύλα, έχεις δει τι έκαναν οι μανιάτες στον Καποδίστρια, θα στείλω όλη τη μανι πάνω σου, ρε γαμημένε.
Very good question, thank you. Λοιπόν, so in order to have a sense of what the sound of the medieval Eastern Roman Empire soundscape was like, we have to understand its modal system. As we have established, the most important legacy of the ancient Greek musical tradition was its modal system, its catalog of different modes, each one of them with a unique sound, with a unique character. Now, our main attestation of the modal reality of the Eastern Roman Empire during the Middle Ages is the Octoechos. The Octoechos is a repertory, a catalog of 8 modes, the 8 canonical modes used in liturgical chanting. This very same Octoechos makes its way during the Carolingian period into the West, is adopted in the Carolingian period. And at first glance, the Octoechos seems to show us a completely diatonic reality. At first glance, taken as it is, the Octoechos seems to be entirely diatonic. This could very much match up with the phenomenon that happened, culturally speaking, in the western parts of the Roman cultural zone. In the parts of the Roman Empire that used to be the Western Roman Empire, the Latin-speaking West, the once complex, diversified modal reality of enharmonic, chromatic, and diatonic became simplified down to only one of its thirds, which is the diatonic third. And even then, not all of the diatonic modes, because you have the Phrygian mode, for example, which is one of the diatonic modes, but the Phrygian is one of those highly characteristically Eastern sounding modes. It was canonically, nominally part of the Octoechos, the catalog of the canonical modes of the Western Church, but it was never really used in Western music. We know, however, that it survived in the Eastern Roman Empire. At first glance, it seems that the music of the Eastern Roman Empire was wholly diatonic in nature, exclusively diatonic. This was the view that Western musicology about 100 years ago used to have. But we have to remember, this was the period when Western musicology believed in the idea that Byzantine chant is a Turkified corruption. They actually believed that the original Christian chanting was the Solesme style Gregorian chanting. And they actually believed that this is what Byzantine chant originally sounded like before being subjected to overwhelming Oriental influence from the Ottomans. Basically, the view of Western musicology back then was that Byzantine chant, as we know it today, is a product of Ottoman modification, Ottoman corruption, and therefore the non-diatonic sounds found in today's Byzantine chant are entirely the product of Ottoman influence. More recent scholarship, however, has very much challenged those ideas.
H.J.W. Tilliard found it necessary to denounce just the use of the enharmonic and chromatic genus as an Ottoman corruption, an opinion which should be regarded as disproven according to recent research. I refer here to my own discussion of Oliver Strunk's presentation of the so-called Byzantine tonal system within my doctoral thesis, but also to Al-Kindi's octoechoes reception during the 9th century. Eckhard Neubauer characterized it as an early knowledge transfer which could not rely yet on the Arabic, Persian, and Syriac translation of Hellenic treatises.
It is believed that the non-diatonic sounds found in today's Byzantine chant were in fact found in the medieval Byzantine liturgical chant. Basically, that medieval Byzantine chant was made up of a core, a fundamental core of diatonic modes, but that microtones, chromatic alterations, non-diatonic sounds would have existed as practical realities that were part of the expression of those diatonic modes. So a diatonic core, but very much with the presence of non-diatonic modes. So the answer to this question seems to be a nuanced one. The Byzantine medieval soundscape was not perhaps as modally varied as the modern Greek musical soundscape with completely non-diatonic modes like the hard chromatic mode. However, it was probably also not, according to more recent scholarship, a wholly exclusively diatonic musical system like that found in medieval Europe. So how should we imagine the sound of the Byzantine Empire? A fundamentally diatonic reality, which does include exotic sounding modes to a Western ear like Phrygian, but a diatonic reality that was not exclusively diatonic, but accompanied with non-diatonic sounds, which were very much a continuation, a legacy of the ancient Greek and harmonic and chromatic genuses.
Λοιπόν, I would like to take this moment to mention the kind sponsor of this video, VPN, Varangian Personal Network. Are you tired of your personal data always being at risk of being raided by Slavs coming into the Aegean Sea, or by Turks that are starting to change the demographic reality of Anatolia? Well, I have very good news for you. For only a few gold coins a year, you can get yourself sexy, tall, buff, blonde, blue-eyed Swedes and Norwegians, that, you know, Alexander Skarsgård kind of looking fellows, to be your personal bodyguards, so people will not steal your personal belongings. They gave me a text to read in their barbaric language. Give me a second, please. Yo har trixi mei för många souvlakis. Yo har jättejobbig diarré. Anyway, visit VPN, Varangian Personal Network. Λοιπόν, now let's talk a little bit about what we know of the secular music of the Eastern Roman Empire. But a word is important first, because in my experience, a lot of people tend to assume that the religious music of a society and the secular music of a society are sort of completely different from one another, are completely separated from one another. But this could not be further from the truth. I often say that religious music is secular music, in the sense that the religious music of a certain culture comes out from the same context as its secular music. The same morphological parameters apply to both of them. When you look at Catholic Gregorian chants from France, for example, they tend to follow the same broad features as that of the rest of French music. The people who wrote the hymns and the psalms and the religious songs in the churches during the day would then go sing in the tavernas the local songs at night. That's just how things work. If you look at Byzantine chants and you look at Greek traditional music, you're looking at a related set of morphological morphological features. Basically, Greek traditional music, this variety of different modal monophonic traditions, should not be viewed as separate from Byzantine chant. Byzantine chant and Greek traditional music, all of them descend from the same roots in ancient Greek and then later Byzantine modal monophonic traditions, and therefore they are two branches of the same tree. Λοιπόν, among the genres of music that would have existed in the Eastern Roman Empire, perhaps some of the most important ones would have been the acclamations and the ceremonial forms of music. The acclamation was a central part of at least the life in the capital of the empire, in Constantinople. The Eastern Roman society was a highly ritualized society with a lot of ceremonies, and for all of these ceremonies there were codified sets of acclamations. The Polychronion, for example, which is a form of acclamation that survives to this day in the Byzantine Orthodox Church, there were these sets of acclamations where you would have, for example, the emperor and his consort and his court entering the church, for example, for a certain service on a Sunday, or for Easter, or for games in the circus, and you would have the people acclamating many years to the emperor, many years to the emperor of the Romans, long live our emperor. And historical research shows us that these kinds of acclamations were very often accompanied with codified sets of music, musical signatures, if you will, musical formulas, that were often played on the organ that would be later adopted by the Western Europeans. And Ioannis Prosiadinos has written what is effectively the only surviving piece of secular Eastern Roman music from the 15th century, and it is a Christmas kontakion. It is an acclamation to welcome the emperor into the church, the Hagia Sophia, I believe.
And he composed this acclamation for the Emperor John VIII, Paleologos, so the second to last Byzantine emperor. Many years to the kings, this is repeated a number of times. To John, the most devout king and emperor of the Romans, Paleologos, and Maria, the most devout Augusta, many years. This is sung by the cantor, then repeated by the people. God make your holy kingdom last for many years.
That is an example of the sort of kind of music that would have been rooted in the tradition of the imperial acclamations during the days of the Eastern Roman Empire. Secondly, amongst the forms of music that would have existed in the Eastern Roman Empire, we find the existence of court music. You always find a form of music that is limited to the court, the imperial form of music. Very often it will tend to be the most complex, the most sophisticated, the most refined form of music found in this society. And finally, of course, there would also have been folk traditions in the plural. Notice how I'm using traditions in the plural. To this day in Greece, the different regional folk traditions are completely different from one another. Now, they all share in common the same broad morphological features of being modal and monophonic, but apart from that, you still see many different regionalisms in Greek music. Thrakiotica is very different from Kritika, is very different from the music in Peloponneso, etc., etc. And this is today, with the centralization of Greece into a centralized nation state. So you can only imagine before the radio, before the internet, what exactly how much variety would have existed back then. But you can imagine that back then, before radio and internet and everything, perhaps Thira would have had a sound of its own that would have been very different from the sound found in Sifnos, which is relatively close to it. So we can imagine that there would have been a high variety of different folk traditions in the Middle Ages, in the days of the Eastern Roman Empire, but unfortunately we cannot know what they were, what they sounded like. All that we know is that they would have been probably even more varied in regional diversity, and that they would have, of course, been modal, monophonic traditions, and so at a fundamental level they would have sounded very much like modern Greek folk songs, but, unfortunately we don't know any more than this. One of the main obstacles that we face in researching Eastern Roman medieval music of the secular kind is that, apart from only one example as far as I know, not a single piece of secular music has survived from the Eastern Roman Empire. All of the music that has survived to us belongs to the liturgical repertoire. So going back into the 900s, we have hymns upon hymns written by the religious music composers. Kalimera. But we have very few surviving pieces of secular music. This, of course, does not pose an extreme problem. This does not leave us completely in the dark because, as we said before, liturgical music and secular music share the same morphological features for the most part. So we can imagine, of course, that the melodies of secular music would, in the broadest of strokes, have been like that of religious music. You don't want to imagine that suddenly the secular music would have sounded completely different. Of course not. They would have shared the same sort of sonorities, the same kind of modes and etc. The best guess that we can make is that it would have sounded something like Byzantine chants of the day, but with instruments. Of course, in the details there would have been differences that we cannot exactly put our finger on, but this is as close as we can get. Perhaps the most important and meaningful distinction between the religious part of Byzantine music and its secular angle was the fact that the religious tradition was solely an a cappella tradition, and it remains so to this day. The early church fathers of the early Roman Empire, of the early Eastern Roman Empire, were very hostile to the usage of instruments in liturgy, and it was also the case in the Latin West, in Western Europe, for a very long time. So if you go to Western Europe, for example, in the early Middle Ages, even back then, the Vatican, the Catholic Church, was highly opposed to the implementation of instruments during liturgy, and only very gradually would the Catholic Church change its stance over the usage of instruments during liturgy. But when we look at the Eastern Roman Empire, this did not change in the slightest over 2,000 years. This is why to this day, if you go to Greek Orthodox churches, nobody will ever use instruments during liturgy. So this is the main point of differentiation between the secular side of Eastern Roman music and the liturgical side. The liturgical was only a cappella. However, if you look at the court traditions of the Eastern Roman Empire, if you look at the... there's some tourists walking here, they're going to be very confused why there's somebody with medieval garb talking. Hello, how are you?
Hi.
So, no problem, go ahead please. So, what was I saying? If you look at the court traditions and everything, there was a very rich tradition of using instruments in the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, when we look at the evolution of the instruments that were used, again, remember, we're looking at 1,000 years of history. Early on in the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, you had instruments that were very much what you would expect from antiquity. Basically, you had the avlos, you had pan flutes, you had a model of a certain lute, kind of padura. However, as we continue into the Middle Ages, the inventory of instruments, if you will, begins to evolve and change over the years. So let's look at the known instruments that were used in the Eastern Roman Empire. First, we find the aerophones, the flutes, etc. A number of different flutes existed and were far more prevalent across Greece than they are today. Today, you mostly find the floiera in Peloponneso, Kavali in the north, and really much of the traditional music of Greece does not use fucking boats making so much sound. Next up, we have the horns and the trumpets. Horns and trumpets were both used by the Eastern Romans principally for either ceremonies or signals and everything. So they would have been used for military signals or for declarations declaring that the emperor is here or something. For most of history, trumpets, and this is very not at all a comfortable position to sit in. For most of history, trumpets and horns and these kinds of instruments tended not to be musical instruments, fully fledged musical instruments, but tended to be far more reserved for declarations and signals and things like that, but they were utilized by the Eastern Romans for sure. So you can also imagine the classic sound of the emperor entering somewhere and trumpets going to do or something like this. Next up, and this is going to be an interesting one, the organ. The organ, surprisingly for many people, actually originates in the works of ancient Greek musicians in antiquity. So the organs existed all the way back in antiquity, and they used to be water organs. I'm not going to go too much into the details, but basically it was through a process of pumping water that the sound of those organs was produced. And they were used across the Roman Empire for many centuries, but they would eventually die out in the Western Roman Empire by the end of antiquity. In the Eastern Roman Empire, however, they did very much survive and were one of the main instruments that were associated with the court, with the emperor. So, for example, we know that in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, you know, the great circus where those great games were happening, when the emperor appeared and the acclamations were happening, the organ was played during these moments. We also have attestations in historical documents of melodic formulas that were meant to be played on the organ. What's very interesting is that it is through the Eastern Roman Empire that the organ will return and make its way back into Western Europe. According to some Greek music historians, the organ was adopted by Charlemagne of the Western Carolingian Empire due to a process of wanting to, how do you say in English, imitate the aesthetics of the Eastern Roman Empire for the purposes of, you would have guessed it, claiming the role of being the successors of Rome. So Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire would have adopted the organ due to its association with imperiality, with imperialism, with the imperial might of Rome, basically, because of that pre-existing association found in the Eastern Roman Empire. And what we see is that later on, the Vatican, the Catholic Church, would have adopted the organ as one of its main instruments, not because of an association with religiosity, mind you, but because after the fall of the Carolingian Empire, the Papal States, the Vatican, saw itself as the next great sort of, European, Latin, Western state to hold sort of all of Christianity together. And so in order to solidify this image of imperial might that we are now sort of, the center of Christianity and everything, they adopted the organ. So what's very interesting is that according to this theory, the organ was adopted by the Catholic Church not because of a religious association or sound, but because of an imperial association, and then later on, because it was frequently used as an instrument in the churches of Western Europe and the Latin West, it now in the Latin West has become synonymous with the sound of Christianity and religion, etc. But it must be understood, the organs were not used in liturgy in the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire's liturgical music was a cappella, and whilst organs did exist, they were solely used as secular music for imperial acclamations, for ceremonial court music. They probably were utilized also alongside ensembles of other instruments. One thing also to note is that when you imagine the Eastern Roman organ, you don't want to imagine these massive organs of the Catholic churches, that are etched into the building itself. You're basically looking at oversized pan flutes for all intents and purposes. So they were about this big, a person size, maybe a little bigger, based on the visual attestations that we have. Next, we have a category of some instruments. There are those instruments that people who listen to Renaissance music and late medieval music will be very familiar with. They were very much used by the Eastern Romans, and they seem to really emerge mostly in the later stages of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, some have said that this might have been due to Western European influence, but others have proposed that it may actually be due to Ottoman influence, because already at that time, before the fall of Constantinople, the Mehter tradition as we know it more or less existed. You had these military marching bands of the Ottomans who used these psalm-like instruments like the zurna, for example, which by the way is still utilized today in modern Greek music. Although it has mostly been replaced by the clarinet. So if you listen to older traditions of Peloponnese on the mainland, Roumeli, etc., they tended to use the zurna kind of psalm-like instruments a lot more, but nowadays they're far more rare due to their replacement by the clarinet. The pan flute, it's surprising to a lot of people from Greece to the Middle East to know that the pan flute was a very, very common instrument, especially in the court forms of music. Up until the 18th century, Anatolian music, Ottoman music, Iranian music and Greek music used to have the pan flute very prominently up until the 1700s. Of course, the pan flute originates in antiquity, hence the name pan flute. It was one of the main instruments used by the ancient Greeks. And it survives in visual attestations, in visual representations of musicians of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now it's time to talk about possibly one of the more important categories of instruments in the medieval Eastern Roman Empire, and this is the bowed instrument category. Now, why is it so interesting to talk about? Because bowed instruments as a category of instruments were not known to have existed for most of antiquity. Usually it is accepted, the consensus of historians is that they emerged late antiquity, early Middle Ages, basically, somewhere in the steppes of Central to East Asia, and it is the westward migration of Turkic tribes and other similar steppes peoples that brings it first into the Middle East and then into Europe. And the first attested presence of a bowed instrument within European soil is the Eastern Roman Empire. In the 9th century, an Iranian ethnographer or whatever, he mentions the presence of a bowed instrument type in the Eastern Roman Empire, a pear-shaped instrument that we have come to refer to as the Byzantine lyra. And this pear-shaped basis is believed to be the basis of all other subsequent iterations of bowed instruments found in Western Europe, from which you will first have similar rebecks, as we call them, with a sort of pear shape, and then as time goes on, you have other developments.
Λοιπόν, after this you have the bagpipe. So the bagpipe is visually attested in the iconography of the Byzantine Empire, of the Eastern Roman Empire. It is of course still used today. A lot of people do not know that bagpipes are not merely a Scottish or Celtic instrument, but are in fact very much a pan-European, pan-Eurasian instruments. Middle Easterners have bagpipes, Balkaners have bagpipes, everybody has bagpipes. They have no specific connection to the Celts, and the Greeks have many, many bagpipes today. And we know that they existed in the Eastern Roman Empire. In fact, they go all the way back to antiquity. In antiquity, we have literary mentions, not iconographical, but literary mentions of the avlos. Avlos was a reed type of instrument, and bagpipes are fundamentally simply reed instruments with bags attached to them. We have mentions of the avlos, a reed instrument, and then we have mentions of the ask avlos, bagpipe, avlos attached to a bag for more airflow, with the bag held under the armpit. So bagpipes are not merely an Eastern Roman instrument, but they are a Greek instrument that goes all the way back to ancient Greece and still exists to this day in modern Greece in many shapes and varieties. After this we have the lute instruments. Now lutes are interesting because in antiquity the lyra and harp-like instruments used to be the main kind of stringed instrument of antiquity, but after antiquity, with the arrival of the early Middle Ages, a cultural shift happens in the Middle East and in Europe, where lute-like instruments become primary, and both in the Middle East and Europe, one specific lute becomes dominant, the oud. The oud, a sort of almond kind of shaped lute with a very specific sound, becomes the king of all stringed instruments, at least plucked stringed instruments, both in the Middle East and in Europe. So just as the French were using the oud, just as the Arabs and the Persians and the Turks were using the oud, so did the Byzantines, so did the Eastern Romans also use the oud, and it is very well attested in visual iconography. Of course, we have different types of drums, mainly tambourine types of drums and kettle kind of drums. So these are interesting. These kettle kind of drums are typically not used in Greek music nowadays, but they have some usage in parts of northern Iran, in Anatolia, for example, and these kinds of drums are very much visually attested in Byzantine music, and one of their particularities is that many of them were pitched drums, tuned drums that were tuned to a very recognizable pitch. We also have zither type instruments, so these are trapezoid wooden boards with strings attached to them. The dulcimer is also a form of zither, so this can be plucked directly with the fingers or struck with hammers. Different types of these sort of psalteries, psalterion as they would have been called, would have existed in the Byzantine Empire. And many musicologists would agree that at a certain point, most likely the kanonaki, the canon of the Islamic world, would probably have entered the Byzantine Empire somewhere after the 1000s. Tourists. They make the economy of this country run, but I don't like them. You're going to say, Aristoxenus, you are racist because they're not Greeks. So stop. 100%. I'm a racist. If you're not Greek, please become Big Mac meat. You have no other use for society, for humanity. Alright, back to me, Faria Fariji. Now what we're going to do for the last chapter of this video, we're going to analyze a piece of music that I've produced this winter, which tries to be a speculative approximation of what medieval Eastern Roman music of the secular kind, of the imperial courtly kind, could have sounded like. So what we're going to do is that we're going to analyze the individual components, identify which parts are speculative, not speculative, everything, in order to get a better understanding, you know, at the end of this, of what, at least an aspect of what medieval Eastern Roman music may have sounded like. So first we start with the basic melody. The melody at its core is modeled on what is effectively, as far as I know, the only surviving secular composition from the medieval Eastern Roman Empire. And to my knowledge, it has only been performed so far by Capella Romana, led by Dr. Alexander Lingas. This is a Christmas kontakion by the Greek composer Ioannis Plosiadinos, and he was from the 15th century. He wrote this for the penultimate emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. So, to begin with, I took the basic skeleton of the melody, this basic melodic progression, and I based the melody off of that. So because this is a written melody that we have that is attested and extant from the Eastern Roman Empire, that's a good place to begin. Next, it was about expanding on the written down melody from the Middle Ages. Religious chants from Greece in the Middle Ages do show us instances of chromatic melodic passages. Those are melodic passages where the notes of the diatonic scale are interspersed with notes that do not belong in the diatonic scale.
Now, according to the works of Dr. Alexander Lingas of Capella Romana, it's up for debate how much Greek religious chanting of the Middle Ages included chromatic passages. We know those chromatic passages did exist in the Middle Ages, but they may not have been as prevalent as they are nowadays. Next was the question of the tuning to be used. Ancient Greek music used Pythagorean tuning, but as we continue into the Middle Ages and into the Ottoman period, at a certain point, Byzantine liturgical music switches to tunings that are slightly different. So the mode, once referred to as the Dorian mode in ancient Greek music, has a somewhat flattened interval by about 30 cents. Which gives us a slightly different effect from the Pythagorean second interval. Now, because of the established overlap between liturgical and secular music, again, as established, if a certain tuning was used within the liturgical tradition, there's no reason to believe the same was not used in the secular tradition. Secular and liturgical traditions do not utilize distinct tuning systems unless something appends that, like happened in modern Greek music. So because of this, the sort of minor scale that is used in this reconstruction uses the flattened second interval that is found in Byzantine chant. That said, this aspect of the reconstruction is extremely speculative because the research that I've done showed me a lot of sort of different possibilities. Basically, it's not entirely certain when this flatter minus 30 kind of tuning on the second interval emerges in Byzantine liturgical chant. Some believe that all the way back into the latter days of the Byzantine Empire, we would have had this kind of tuning. Some others believe that it's really with the reforms 200 years ago that it enters. So this is extremely speculative. I went with that because at a certain point you just have to make some decisions with some reconstructions, but it is very possible that the Pythagorean tuning that's not as flat would have been the one that Plousiadinos himself would have used, and that this more microtonal one that I'm using may very well in fact not be applicable to the era of the late 15th century Eastern Roman Empire. And then came the question of the instrumentation. What instrumentation were we going to utilize? Well, that is the part that is best attested when it comes to secular Byzantine music. We do have access to their instrumental palette. It was important for me to use sort of the main ones that we know would have been used back then. So of course we used the oud. I opted to use a kanonaki. So this is like one of the parts where I'm like, okay, highly speculative, because again, whilst we do have attestations of psalteries and zither-like instruments in Byzantine secular music, the kanonaki, I haven't found any direct, clear indications that the kanonaki specifically was used. So I'm not going to die on the hill that they used the kanonaki. The reason I used one was because, well, if not that, what kind of zithers do I use? And Chrysodoros Chalaris used kanonakis, and I'm thinking he had a reason for using them, so I'm trusting Chrysodoros Chalaris. After that, there was the presence of the lira, of course, the Byzantine lira, which was one of the main instruments of that tradition. I did have a friend who did have access to a model of a reconstructed Byzantine lira in the form of the shape of the lira, but the strings that he has are made of metal. We know the strings back then would have been made of gut, and so Dimitrios Dallas and I decided to opt for the usage of a Thraci lira from the north of Greece. The Thracian lira is the most conservative form of lira in its construction and its materials in Greece today. It still uses gut strings. Its body and shape more or less resembles pretty much the liras that would have existed back then in the days of the Byzantine Empire.
The most closely related to what would be considered the Byzantine lira. This still uses gut strings.
And because the strings are made of gut, we believe that this would be, even though it's not a direct reconstruction of a historical Greek instrument, it is close enough and interchangeable enough with Greek historical instruments that we believed with the gut strings it would give the highest fidelity regarding the time period. Then amongst the instruments used, we also utilized a pan flute. And the organ was also used. Again, not your typical kind of organ that you imagine, the Catholic organ that's as big as a church building. I utilized the sound of an organ. I think they're called portative organs. They're basically those little chamber organs that were utilized in Western Europe, and most music historians believe that that is pretty much the proportion and the kind of sound that would have been produced by the Byzantine medieval Greek organs. There comes a question of how the melody is to be performed. We followed the norm of these modal monophonic traditions as attested both today and in history, of following a general heterophonic following of the modal monophonic structure. So all the notes follow the same basic melody, adding little grace notes or ornaments or passages in between without introducing counterpoint or harmony or anything of the sort. A big question, however, was whether or not I wanted to use isokratima. Isokratima is something that exists in modern received Byzantine chant, may have existed in the Middle Ages depending on who you ask. Now again, because of the strong overlap between the liturgical and the secular traditions, I believe that if isokratima did exist in the religious tradition, I see no reason to say that therefore it would not have existed at all in the secular tradition. With that said, the fundamental problem is because isokratima is so strongly debated, and it's not established that it did exist in the days of the Byzantine Empire, I decided to opt to not use it in my reconstruction of secular music, because I really wanted this reconstruction to be sort of safe, if you will, and to really be limited mostly to as little speculation as possible, basically, and limit itself mostly to that which is attested. And that's basically how you get the sum total of a speculative approximation of what medieval Greek music could have sounded like. Unfortunately, there's too much in terms of the details that we don't know, where, I will not present this reconstruction as, this is what it would have sounded like. No, it's as close an approximation as we can have based on what we do know of the instruments and what we do know of the musical aspects that were utilized back then, but there's so much that we don't know that this must be remembered that this is a speculative approximation, but only an approximation, and nothing more, basically. Originally, Aristoxenus was supposed to film this segment, but I quickly understood it was a bad idea when we started shooting, because we are talking about the liturgical chant. It's tied to the religious beliefs of millions of people, Orthodox Christians and even broader Christians in general who may identify with Orthodox music. And Aristoxenus is kind of a coarse person, not the most diplomatic person, and as a pagan, he doesn't have the highest view of Christianity. So I thought I will do this segment in order not to potentially offend anybody. When we look at Byzantine chant, what do we mean by Byzantine chant? What we mean by Byzantine chant specifically is the liturgical musical tradition of the Eastern Roman Empire. Nowadays, the term Byzantine chant may have an alternative meaning, because when people think of Byzantine chant today, they're thinking of the received tradition. For a historical discussion, it is, I believe, helpful to distinguish the received tradition from the historical tradition. So most people are familiar with the received tradition of Byzantine chant. What is the received tradition? It is the current codified form of liturgical Byzantine chant of the last 200 years. It has its classics, its own repertoire, its own stylistic parameters, its own music theory, and it is not exactly the same as that of medieval Byzantine chant. So just to clarify, when we talk about the modern Byzantine chant, the received tradition, we are talking about a tradition that is present. Its epicenter obviously is Greece. You find it in Romania, in Serbia, Bulgaria, Cyprus. The Levantine Arab Christians also use this system of chant, and it must be understood it's not synonymous with Orthodox chant as a whole. That must be understood. A lot of people seem to believe that Orthodox chant is represented, by Byzantine chant. No, the Russians and the Ukrainians, for example, they use a system of chanting that is Western European in its music theory, whereas the music theory of the received tradition is very much native to Greece, and it is a continuation of the old modal monophonic practices going back to ancient Greece. But now that we've established that the received tradition is not the exact same as the historical tradition, the question must be asked, well, how different are they and how similar are they? And here we must be very careful not to fall within two possible extremes. The first extreme, of course, is the classic, Byzantine chant sounds Oriental, must be the Turks. The Turks came in and they brainwashed the Greeks into losing their culture, and that's why they sing like this. But before that, they would have sung like Gregorian chant. We know this not to be true. We know this not to be true because Gregorian chant at a certain point in the past in Western Europe sounded more like Byzantine chant does today. So that whole Oriental feeling of Byzantine chant, the melismatic, highly ornamented, moving and vibrating a lot throughout many notes on a single word. That not only is not something that is a product of something uniquely Middle Eastern, this was a European way of singing that dominated French medieval music and English medieval music up until, around the 1200s. And after that point, it begins to dissipate. I have an entire video about this subject. The point being, we have to be careful about this extreme. It's not true that Byzantine chant, as we know it today, is some, Middle Eastern imposition into Greece that came into the country with the Ottoman conquest. However, on the other hand, there's the other extreme of people who will say that, it's the exact same as it was in the Middle Ages. And this is also not true. The received tradition is distinct from the historical tradition. So what we're going to do is, we are going to look at the way in which the tradition today is similar and continuous with the medieval tradition, and also the ways in which it is not, to get a more complete picture of the question at hand.
Let us begin with the first point of similarity, which is that the medieval Byzantine tradition and the received tradition both used fundamentally the same music theory. And please focus on the operative word here, fundamentally. The details have changed, new elements have been added, some elements have been lost, some elements have been tweaked, but for the most part, in both cases, you are looking at a monophonic, modal tradition rooted in ancient Greek music theory.
As we've established, many of the modes that are found today in the received tradition date all the way back, not only to medieval Byzantine chant, but even to ancient Greek music. You have the ancient Greek Dorian mode, for example, which nowadays in Western music theory is referred to as the Phrygian mode, much to Aristoxenus' dismay. The two terms have been swapped during the Middle Ages by some monks or something. Now, this mode has been called the C major of the ancient Greeks by researchers such as Stefan Hagel. It was the preferred main mode in ancient Greek music theory. It is possibly still one of the most popular modes in modern Greek music. Half of laiko, which is the sort of a modern pop tradition of Greek music, is in that mode, which they call usak for the most part nowadays. And it is also found in not only today's received tradition chants, but also in ancient Greek music. Many of the other modes, like that which we would call the minor and everything, the major. So there's a definite sense of continuity between the received tradition and the medieval tradition, in the sense that many of the modes have been kept and are still used to this day. Okay, so we've established the ways in which Byzantine received music, the current tradition, is continuous with the ancient tradition. Primarily that it uses the same fundamental music theory, a monophonic music theory rooted in the usage of modes, expressed primarily through ornamentative vocal delivery with a lot of melisma. And of course, many of the modes are continuous. But now let's look at the ways in which the received tradition of today is different from the medieval tradition. Well, once again, the modes are one of the points of difference.
For example, we have the very recognizable sound of the hard chromatic mode. The hard chromatic is this Hijaz double harmonic kind of sound, very recognizable and evocative of the modern Byzantine sound. There is, however, no attestation for it in the Middle Ages.
Not all of the modes used in today's received tradition existed back then.
Another point of difference between the two traditions would be the fact that the melodic progressions were not necessarily always the same. Even when the modes used were the same, the way those modes were used, the way songs were constructed using those modes would not always yield the exact same results. You see, you have the same modes across the same cultures, but very often the musical styles of those cultures still ends up sounding different because they don't write melodies with progressions or with structures using the same configuration of notes in the same exact way. Even if you use the same configuration of notes, you will not yield necessarily the same results because there's still a spectrum of options in how you can use those notes.
The tunes were different in the Middle Ages. Maybe even if like we sing today, Christos genate doxasate for the beginning of the Christmas canon of Cosmas of Jerusalem. And maybe in the Middle Ages they sang Christos genate doxasate, so what? They're both D minor scales, whatever. And then we have change over time, and some tunes changed a little, some not very much at all. Like one that changed almost not at all is the prologue for Romanus's Christmas Kontakion, I Parthenos Simeron. The earliest manuscript that we have a short melody for it is from the 13th century. It's today in St. Petersburg, and it's I Parthenos Simeron, something like that. And the modern melody is I Parthenos Simeron. It's exactly the same tune. One has a couple more ornaments on a couple notes. That's one where it's pretty much the same tune for the last 7 centuries. So again, there is lots of evidence for continuity. And there's some other cases where things have changed somewhere they've changed a bit more.
For example, you can imagine this musical progression in the current received tradition is extremely popular. Something like Iereon podiri katakos mumenos. Generally speaking, this melodic formula is extremely common nowadays, but we don't necessarily find it in the Middle Ages, and their melodic formulas that they would have used using those exact same notes, by the way, those exact same modes. We just would find different ones in the Middle Ages. Another thing to talk about, and this is really fascinating, this would be one of the aspects that would really be obvious to anybody going back into the Middle Ages. Different vocal postures and vocal styles would have been en vogue back then and are unimaginable nowadays. In Constantinople, there was a tradition of a eunuch choir in the Eastern Roman Empire. Men with falsetto voices, basically. The funny thing is nowadays, when you say Byzantine chant to a lot of people, to most people, they imagine, nobody imagines Iereon podiri. No, they imagine Iereon. They imagine a bass baritone kind of voice. That sort of has solidified itself as the almost official kind of sound of Byzantine chant. One can perhaps better understand the latter by shedding inherited preconceptions regarding the proper sound of Christian chant, the ideals for which have varied significantly according to place and time. This is, of course, easier said than done, particularly today when the vibrant received tradition of Byzantine chanting possesses sonic attributes that are immediately recognized and increasingly being adopted even by non-Greeks as an oral badge of orthodoxy. Fans of the testosterone-soaked modern Greek cantorial scene, for example, would undoubtedly be more than a little shocked to hear the patriarchal vocal style patriarchiko ύφος of 12th century eunuchs. But back then, not only we had eunuch vocalists, we also had women singing with men. Yes, almost unimaginable nowadays, but back then, male and female voices were mixed in the Hagia Sophia itself. This, in fact, was something that really marked the attention of Western European Latin Frankish travelers, of Latin or so-called Frankish travelers going into the Eastern Roman Empire. The one thing that really marked the attention of the Western European travelers was the mixing of male and female voices, something unimaginable back then in the Latin West. Wesh, Aristoxenus?
Έλα ρε περωτάι, τι κάνεις φιλέ? Ça va la famille, les affaires et tout?
Il m'est calé, frère Aristo, comme d'hab, quoi, comme d'hab. Resta du Moyen-Âge, hein, c'est pas facile la vie de Resta, mais qu'est-ce que tu veux, ouais, je vais faire un feat bientôt avec Bouba, on va niquer des mers, ça rase concert à Marseille, wesh. Qu'est-ce pose pas, iré, voilà, comblé.
Καλά, ευχαριστώ. Listen, je vais te faire écouter quelque chose, ok?
Ok, ouais, j'écoute, vas-y, balance la sauce, wesh. Mais c'est quoi ça? Mais c'est quoi? C'est des femmes qui chantent avec des hommes? Oh non, mais là c'est dégueulasse, oh non, mais putain, oh, mais c'est pour ça que les Vénitiens vous ont niqué vos mères, wesh. Non mais c'est dégueulasse, non mais orthodoxe, orthopédiatre, orthopédé, niquez vos mères, wesh. Those in fact are not an innovation, they're seen as an innovation of modernity, oh, making women sing and everything. But in fact, in the imperial center of Constantinople, women sang alongside men and their voices mixed.
We have to make some big steps, and the history has spoken. We have chanters in Byzantine era. Okay? Modern theological and musicological research have proven that. So history has spoken. Theologians, critical theologians and scholars have also spoken. Important clergy, some of whom are university professors, have also spoken. What remains is the church to take a position, a real position, an official position, a clear position about this topic.
Now, another aspect of the modern received tradition that may differ from the medieval tradition is whether or not the ison existed in the medieval tradition. The ison is the supporting drone of Byzantine chant. Most often you will have heard it in the form of a low hum accompanying the music. It can also come in the form of actually singing the vocals, but singing them as a drone. So for example, you'll have the main vocals going and then you'll have the Sokratima who are singing the ison, and they'll be going Κατακοσμούμενος, ιερέων ποδήρι, κατακοσμούμενος. That is an inescapable part of the received current tradition of Byzantine chant, but it is very hotly debated within some circles whether or not it existed in the Middle Ages. Some deem the ison to be a Western influence that is a kind of impartation of harmony, but not exactly. Other very important musicologists and researchers of the Byzantine tradition, like John Michael Boyer, for example, that the ison is not at all an early primitive attempt at harmonization or even an importation from Western harmonization, but instead a strengthening of the monophonic structure of the song. Because when the drone changes, it doesn't change on the basis of a harmonic interval like in Western music. It's not like, oh, well, this note has to harmonize with this note and this note with this note. No, like that doesn't matter at all. If you look at the basic form of modern ison that I did, it's simply holding the tonic as, you know, the song goes forward, and then whilst the song goes downwards, in order to complete, well, then we switch from the tonic to the note underneath it in order to strengthen the sense of the descent downwards of the melody. This does not necessarily need to be a Western importation that is recent and comes with the Westernization of Balkanic and Greek music. It may very well be just an internal development, a sort of extrapolation of monophonic practices. Whatever it is, we don't have any direct attestation of Ison or Isokratima in the historical records. Now, the Simon Karas school of thought definitely espouses the notion that Ison did exist in the Middle Ages, and their argument for that is a passage found in some texts which says that a certain chant should be accompanied using like accompaniment. Some word along those lines. I'll write the exact word on screen. Now, it doesn't go into detail. It doesn't say that they have to use Ison and everything, but the Simon Karas interpretation is, what else could that be but Isokratima?
A fundamental difference between the Gregorian chant and the Byzantine music consists in the so-called Ison technique. She is unknown in the practice of Gregorian repertoire. There are, however, many indications that she was known in the early period of the Old Roman chant. In this connection is remarkable that the papal chapel, the Schola Cantorum, consisted of 7 singers with the names Pria Scoli, Secunda Scoli, Tertius Scoli, Archiparaphonista, and 3 further paraphonisti. What means the term paraphonista? It means one singer who sings beside the melody. This is perhaps an indication for the performance of the Ison technique.
I'm not going to weigh in on that debate. I don't know. I'm just telling you those are the positions within the field of music history right now. And I think it may be surprising to some people how much of a role Ison plays in modern received tradition Byzantine chant. If you remove the Ison, a fundamental variable of the musical experience is taken away. And so, you know, without the Ison, we may be looking at a very, very different musical landscape when it comes to the liturgical tradition of the Middle Ages. So the question is up in the air. Some believe that Ison emerged, during the days of the Eastern Roman Empire. Some believe that it emerged very late into the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. Most, I think, believe that it would have emerged somewhere in the 15th or 16th centuries. But basically, we don't know if the Ison existed in the Middle Ages or not. It's also important to understand that the Byzantine liturgical tradition was not static throughout the Middle Ages. It kept evolving and it kept changing. I think one of the pitfalls that many people fall into is to believe that, well, okay, European music used to be modal, and then in Western Europe, it created a new paradigm, which is that of tonality. And so therefore, the traditions to the East, like Greece and Turkey in the Middle East, were stagnant and they didn't create anything new. This is a very wrong way to look at it, because just because you haven't created a new paradigm does not mean that you're not innovating within this paradigm. And the innovations within that pre-existing paradigm may be as bold and as creative as coming up with a new paradigm sometimes. When it comes to the modal aspect of Byzantine chant, that monophonic aspect really began being strengthened over the centuries. In Western Europe, the more time goes by, the more we reach towards the early modern era, the more vertical the music becomes. And you have melodies stacked on top of melodies, and harmony begins crystallizing in the way that we know of it today. But in the Eastern Roman Empire, the modal monophonic aspect began becoming more and more monophonic, in fact, and that's how you get the rise of callophonia. And callophonia, in my opinion, is one of the great artistic forms of music that is unsung. It is literally sung, of course, but it is unsung in terms of it's not praised enough outside of the Greek Orthodox world. Callophonia were compositions that began arising by the late Middle Ages in the Eastern Roman Empire, where a single syllable of a word would be given a lot of syllables and a lot of notes. And the callophonic repertoire is of such complexity complexity, such difficulty to pull off. It's incredibly long form compositions that just go on and don't stop like rivers, always getting you into new directions and everything. With a vocalist having to sing every one of those pitches perfectly, moving in and out of those pitches, doing all those ornamentations, going chromatic, not chromatic, etc. I mean, it is absolutely crazy when you listen to these colophonic compositions. The colophonic repertoire has been called by some musicologists as the Ars Nova of the East. Ars Nova was the musical school or the musical sort of phase of Western European music where we see, a lot of the emergence of early European harmony and tonality, what will end up becoming European tonality as we know it, and a lot of the great polyphonic works by masters like Guillaume de Machaut. But in the East, things followed a complexification on the horizontal level where you reach the calophonic phases of music making. And so Byzantine chant never was stagnant. You had the formation of new genres, new repertoires, new fashions, new ways of writing within that paradigm. It must be understood, Byzantine chant of the Middle Ages was not at all static. So the idea that the modern received tradition is the exact same as that of the Middle Ages is utterly preposterous, because even that of the 14th century was not the same as that of the 9th centuries. However, ultimately, they are one and the same tradition, only one and the same tradition changed by time. For the most part, however, the layperson, if you were to teleport them to Constantinople in the 12th century, I don't think they would necessarily be able to tell that it's a different form of music or a different form of chant, but probably psalts and musicologists and music theorists would be able to pick up the difference.
Oh, Aristoxenus, you should not drink so much. It's not good for your health. It's not good maybe for my physical health. You know what's not good for my mental health? Having to deal with you people, you modern people. You will tell me, Aristoxenus, you're an ancient Greek supremacist. Knowing that you are all animals beneath ancient Greeks does not make me a supremacist, okay? I don't want to get political. Let's continue. I want to have a few words on the subject of what is the context of Eastern Roman music. And by context, I mean the spatial context, the physical context, because that is the most important thing for the sound of a certain civilization's music. Your direct physical periphery, that is going to be the musical taxonomy that you belong to. If we are to place the music of the Eastern Roman Empire within a spatial continuum that defines its spatial context, then it will be the continuum of the Eastern Mediterranean, Near Eastern, Middle Eastern modal regions. After the 1300s and onwards, the music of the Latin-speaking West, especially around France, England, Italy, etc., begins cultivating a more vertical form of music theory that gives birth to Western tonality. However, the music of the Eastern Roman Empire never took part into these developments. As we have talked about in the previous chapter, the more we continue in the Middle Ages, the more monophonic and horizontal the music becomes in the Eastern Roman Empire. So the fundamental category that the Eastern Roman Empire's music belonged to was the same category as that of the Makamic traditions of the Middle East. Let me illustrate this with an example. We talked about the hard chromatic modes, ne? This double harmonic major Hijaz-Kar kind of sound. The ancient Greeks, we had this in our chromatic modes. Modern Greeks, they have this. But it is not attested anywhere in the Middle Ages. So how do we explain this? If there is a gap between the modern Greek music and the ancient Greek music, how do we explain? A very good answer would be perhaps Middle Eastern influence. As we have established at the beginning of the video, the Makamic Middle Eastern traditions were fundamentally rooted in ancient Greek musical developments. This Hijaz kind of sound, for the first time in history, is attested in ancient Greek music. It is believed that its presence in Middle Eastern music is most likely due to ancient Greek influence.
For Greek melodies were indeed Oriental, and their next of kin have lived in the Middle East to this day, not in the West. And the nearly 100 scales of the Islamic Orient are not only the exact counterparts of the various Grecian shades, but the great majority of them are actually mixed. Hijaz, the most oriental scale of all, consists of a chromatic tetrachord and a diatonic pentachord. At a certain point in time, this Hellenic sound, of this Hijaz kind of sound, made its way into the Middle Eastern musical idioms. Clearly, it seems to have disappeared from the medieval Greek-speaking world, but it survived in the Middle Eastern regions and then probably was brought back into Greece, perhaps with the Ottoman conquest, for example. The Ottomans had systematized this sound into their Makamic system, and perhaps with the inclusion of Greece as a province of the Ottoman Empire and this cultural cross-fertilization, this sound made its way back. But this is the thing that must be understood. Yes, it is a Middle Eastern influence, but a Middle Eastern influence that itself was rooted in Hellenic influence, because the Middle East and the Hellenic world were always connected by physical proximity and therefore were always part of the same continuing stew of an ongoing dialogue in the musical systems.
There was crosstalk between them. If you think about it, the musical cultures of that region, they all have something in common, which is the microtones.
Yes.
They in the horizontal progression of the melody. You know, in Western music, you hear Western music and you've got like chords, like when you play chords.
Yeah.
But in Eastern music, there's less chords and more a unison melody, like one melody.
You see, when Middle Eastern influence occurs in Byzantine music, some people will talk about Oriental influences. But this usage of the term Oriental implies a separation, as if Byzantine music was not itself Oriental. Remalaka, Byzantine music itself was intrinsically, inherently as Oriental as the Arabic music. What do we mean by Oriental? In this context, we mean a set of morphological, musicological features such as horizontality, modality, a shared root and ethos in ancient Greek musical theory. In this sense, Byzantine music was every bit as Oriental as the Arabic musical tradition. From the Middle Ages onwards, there was a vibrant modal geographical community of Perso-Arabic, Turkish, Greek music. And unfortunately, due to Western romantic narratives of the 19th century, we still have a tendency to artificially separate the Greek part of this community, acting as if it were somehow separate from it. So we must do away with this sort of Europe versus Orient paradigm when we're dealing with the Byzantine. Paradigma is a Greek word. You know, every word in every language is from Greek. Alien languages, their words are from Greek. You don't believe me? Look at the Andromeda galaxy. What language do you think they speak? What's the name of their galaxy? Andromeda. There you go, Greek. See? What is, however, an instance of a completely separate musical idiom beginning to influence Greek music happens in the 20th and 19th centuries, when the Western musical idiom becomes imported into Greek music through institutional means. So over the course of the Middle Ages, the Latin-speaking West begins developing the tonal harmonic system that makes it very, very different from what continues on in the East with a more horizontal development. And at a certain point after the Renaissance, we have the birth of the tonal Western harmonic system. In the 20th and 19th centuries, when Greece is liberated from the Ottoman Empire, the political processes back then were about getting rid of the Ottoman Oriental stigma and therefore westernizing Greek culture as much as possible. And so the leaders of the Greek state implemented institutions that very, I don't want to say forcefully, but very calculatedly brought in Western tonal harmony, coming from the state-sponsored sort of efforts coming down from above, from the institutional push. The Western tonal harmony made its way into Greek music, and from the 19th century onwards, a lot of Greek music was from then on based in Western tonal harmony. So now the question has to be asked, what are the kinds of music in Greek music today that are the ones that are historically contiguous with that of the Eastern Roman Empire and therefore
indirectly with ancient Greek music. Okay, now that we know a little bit about the medieval music of Greece, what is the surviving aspect of it? How does it survive? From the 20th century onwards, there have been two branches of Greek music that have come to exist, but from different origins. So you have Laiko. Laiko is from the branch of music that came from the westernization of Greek music. Westernization meaning the adoption of the Western tonal musical system. So you have a branch of Greek music in which you have the Greek classical music, the operas, Laiko, which is sort of the pop music of modern Greece. All of these are mostly rooted in the Western musical system. That's the school of very important and influential composers like Theodorakis, for example, who is the one who wrote the Zorba theme.
Theodorakis was his own thing. The Laiko and that was, it's completely, I won't say disconnected because there was influence.
Yeah, of course.
It's its own. I think it's when we start getting into composers like Theodorakis, Hadzidaki, the people that actually studied more Western
They're
music.
more from a Western base than the Zorba's dance, like that famous song, fucking song. I like it, I don't hate it. People think that I hate that song.
I hate it.
So you hate it?
I can't stand it.
The thing that drives me mad is when people say, oh, but that's Cretan music. No, it's not. It's not, no, that's not, no, okay.
Well, the Theodorakis that wrote it was Cretan.
He was Cretan and Zorba is Cretan, but really fundamentally it's like Laiko. However, the Greek folk songs, the traditional music, the body of Greek traditional music that you find from Thrace to Macedonia, Peloponnesos, the Kyklades, etc., all of them are in a direct line of continuity with Byzantine medieval music, with the medieval music of Greece, meaning these are musical forms that are mostly rooted in a monophonic tradition of having one melody, perhaps with the Socratem as we looked at it, but for the most part there is one melodic line, there's no harmony, there's no chords and everything. Now, of course, that is not to say that the folk songs are themselves directly from the Middle Ages. We have to be careful about this. A lot of their motifs, lyrically and everything, perhaps melodic patterns in them, do come from the Middle Ages. However, the songs themselves are not necessarily from the Middle Ages, but the musical language, the style, the DNA that they use comes from these ancient times going back to the Middle Ages. So when you hear Nisiotica, when you hear Thrakiotica, when you hear the music of Crete and everything, those are the musical forms that have the most direct line of influence with Byzantine music of the Middle Ages.
και ζωνίζω και διγάδι και ζωνίζω και